On a spring afternoon in 1911, an old man was playing golf in Westchester County, New York. He was 71 years old. He had lost most of his hair to an illness years earlier and wore a wig. He played golf almost every day, slowly with a doctor's approval, because he intended to live a very long time. A messenger came out onto the course with a telegram. The Supreme Court of the United States had just ruled against him. His company, the largest, most profitable, most hated business enterprise in the world, had been ordered to break itself apart. 30 years of building dismantled by court order. The story that gets told is that John D. Rockefeller turned to the man he was playing with, a Catholic priest, and said something to the effect of, "Buy Standard Oil." That story may well have been improved in the retelling, treated as folklore rather than fact. But whether or not he said it, it was the correct advice. Because over the next several years, the pieces of the broken company became worth dramatically more than the whole company had ever been. And John D. Rockefeller, who owned roughly a quarter of all of it, watched his fortune climb to the highest point it would ever reach. The United States government spent a decade trying to destroy the greatest monopoly in its history. It succeeded. The monopoly was broken into 34 separate companies, and the man who owned it got richer than he had ever been. This is the story of how that happened, and of what those 34 fragments went on to become, which is arguably the more important part, because you have heard of several of them, and you may be paying one of them this month. To understand the breakup, you have to understand what was broken. Go back to Cleveland, Ohio in 1870. Oil is a new industry and a chaotic one. Crude is being pulled out of western Pennsylvania in enormous and unpredictable quantities. Prices swing violently. Refineries are small, numerous, and mostly badly run. It is a boom, which means most people in it will lose money. Rockefeller is 31 years old, and he is not a wildcatter. He never drilled for oil in any serious way. He was a bookkeeper by training, and he understood something the drillers did not. The money was not in finding oil. The money was in the middle, in refining it, moving it, and controlling the flow. So he built Standard Oil, and he grew it in a way that was ruthless and at the time largely legal. The central weapon was transport. Railroads in the 1870s desperately needed steady, predictable freight. Rockefeller could offer that, enormous, reliable volumes of oil every week. In exchange, he negotiated lower rates than his competitors received. And then he went further, and this is the part that made him genuinely hated. In some arrangements, Standard Oil received not only a discount on its own shipping, but a payment on the shipping of its competitors. A rival refiner would pay the railroad to move his oil, and a portion of that payment would find its way to Standard Oil. Think about what that does. Every barrel your competitor ships makes you money. He is funding the company that is trying to destroy him, and he does not necessarily know it. With that cost advantage, the rest followed. Rockefeller would approach a rival refiner and make an offer. "Sell to me." The offer was usually fair by the numbers. The alternative was made obvious. Compete against a company that could undercut you indefinitely and was being subsidized by your own freight bills. Most of them sold. In the space of a few months in 1872, Standard Oil absorbed the great majority of the refining capacity in Cleveland. The industry called it the Cleveland Massacre. By the 1880s, the structure had a name: the Standard Oil Trust. Shareholders in dozens of nominally separate companies handed their shares to a small group of trustees who ran the whole thing as one organization. It was a legal device to hold together something that state corporation law was not designed to permit. And it worked. At its height, Standard Oil controlled the overwhelming majority of American refining. It set the price of kerosene, which was what most Americans lit their homes with before electricity. It owned pipelines, tank cars, barrel factories, and its own distribution network reaching into small towns across the country. There is a real argument, made at the time and still made now, that this was not purely destructive. Kerosene got cheaper and more consistent under Standard Oil than it had been in the chaotic years. Rockefeller genuinely believed he had brought order to an industry that was destroying itself. The country did not care. What Americans saw was one man who controlled the light in their houses and the price they paid for it. The person who did the most to turn that resentment into a political force was a journalist named Ida Tarbell. Tarbell had a reason to look closely. She had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil region. Her father had been an independent oil man, and he was among those ruined in the years when Standard Oil consolidated the industry. She had watched it happen from inside the house. Between 1902 and 1904, she published a serialized investigation in McClure's magazine. It was not a polemic, it was documentary work. Company records, court testimony, interviews, laid out methodically across 19 installments and later collected as a book. It landed with enormous force. Rockefeller had spent decades being deliberately invisible. Tarbell made the mechanics of the company legible to ordinary readers, and what they read was the rebate system, the pressure campaigns, and the systematic elimination of competitors. Public feeling hardened into something a government could act on. The legal instrument already existed. The Sherman Antitrust Act had passed in 1890, prohibiting combinations in restraint of trade. For years, it had been used more aggressively against labor unions than against corporations. Under Theodore Roosevelt and then William Howard Taft, that changed. The federal case against Standard Oil ran for years. In May of 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its judgment. Standard Oil was an unlawful monopoly. It was ordered dissolved. Now here is where it gets interesting. How do you actually break up a company? You cannot simply confiscate it. The shareholders own it, and their ownership is legally protected. What the court ordered was that the parent company distribute its holdings in its subsidiaries directly to its own shareholders. So Standard Oil of New Jersey, the holding company, handed out shares in the constituent businesses to the people who owned Standard Oil. 34 separate companies emerged. If you held 10% of Standard Oil before the ruling, you now held 10% of every one of the 34 pieces. John D. Rockefeller held roughly a quarter of the whole enterprise. After the breakup, he held roughly a quarter of each fragment. He had not lost a single share. He had exchanged one piece of paper for 34. And then the value of those 34 went up. There are several reasons, and they compound. The first is that the market had been pricing in the lawsuit. For years, everyone knew the government was coming for Standard Oil, and nobody knew what the outcome would be. Uncertainty depresses a share price. When the ruling landed and the uncertainty was resolved, the discount came off. The second is that separated companies could be valued properly. Inside the trust, the whole thing had been an opaque block. Rockefeller had run it in deliberate secrecy for decades, disclosing as little as the law allowed. Once the pieces were independent, each had to report separately, and investors could see what they actually owned. Several of those businesses turned out to be far more valuable than anyone outside had understood. The third reason is the largest, and it had nothing to do with the court: the automobile. For most of Standard Oil's existence, its main product was kerosene for lamps. Gasoline had been close to a nuisance byproduct, but the Model T arrived in 1908, and through the 1910s, the number of cars in America began to climb in a way that had no precedent. The industry that had been broken up was, at exactly that moment, walking into the largest demand expansion any industry had ever seen. Every fragment of Standard Oil owned refineries, pipelines, and distribution networks pointed directly at that wave. And the fourth reason is the most uncomfortable one. They did not really compete. Not at first, and not for a long time. The 34 companies came out of the breakup with their territories already divided by geography. Standard Oil of New York served the Northeast. Standard Oil of California served the West. Standard Oil of Indiana served the middle of the country. Standard Oil of Ohio served Ohio. They largely stayed where they were. They shared the same corporate history, the same train management, in many cases the same major shareholders, and they had spent 40 years learning not to undercut one another. The court had drawn lines on a map. It had not created rivals. Put those four things together and you get a result that reads like a joke. Within a few years of the government destroying the largest monopoly in American history, the pieces were collectively worth several times what the whole had been worth on the day of the verdict. Rockefeller's personal fortune reached its peak in this period. He had been rich before 1911, he became substantially richer afterward, and by some measures, his wealth relative to the size of the American economy has never been matched by anyone since. He also spent the last decades of his life giving enormous sums away, to medical research, to universities, to public health work that measurably saved a great many lives. Both of those things are true about the same man, and any honest account has to hold them together. Now, what happened to the 34 pieces? This is the part that matters most, because the story does not end in 1911. It has been running ever since. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Esso and then Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Saucony, then Saucony Vacuum, then Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Continental Oil became Conoco. Atlantic Refining eventually became part of Arco. Standard Oil of Ohio was eventually absorbed by BP. Look at that list and notice what it is. It is not a list of historical curiosities. It is a substantial portion of the modern oil industry. And then watch what they did over the following century. They grew and then they began to reassemble. Chevron acquired Gulf Oil in 1984. In 1998 and 1999, British Petroleum acquired Amoco. And in 1999, Exxon and Mobil, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, the two largest pieces of the original company, merged into a single corporation. 88 years after a court ordered them separated, the two biggest fragments of Standard Oil put themselves back together and the government approved it. There is a third act to this, and it is the one that reaches furthest. In the decades after the breakup, the largest of these companies did not stay American. They went out into the world, and in particular into the Middle East, and negotiated the concessions that would determine who controlled the world's oil supply for the next 50 years. 3 of the 7 companies that came to dominate global oil in the mid-20th century were direct descendants of Standard Oil. They negotiated agreements dividing up territory and production across the Persian Gulf and beyond. Arrangements between a small number of Western firms about who would extract what and where and in what quantity. The structural habits of Standard Oil, divide the territory, control the flow, avoid competing with your peers, did not die in 1911. They were exported. Every argument you hear today about oil prices, about who controls a shipping lane, about what a barrel costs and why, sits on top of a system whose architecture was designed by companies that were, originally, one company in Cleveland, Ohio. So what did the breakup actually accomplish? Something real, and it should not be dismissed. The specific abuses ended. The rebate system, the secret arrangements with railroads, the ability of a single organization to set the price of a household necessity across a continent, those things stopped. The Sherman Act was proven to have teeth, and that mattered for every antitrust case that came after. But if the goal was to reduce the power of the men who ran Standard Oil, it failed completely. Rockefeller emerged richer. The management emerged intact and distributed across 34 companies instead of concentrated in one. The market position, protected by geography and habit, largely survived. and the entities created by the breakup went on to become larger and more globally powerful than the original company had ever been. There is a general lesson in this, and it is not really about oil. When a government breaks up a company, it is doing something specific and limited. It is changing a legal structure. It is redrawing lines on an organizational chart. It is not redistributing the ownership. It is not removing the expertise. It is not eliminating the assets or the infrastructure or the relationships. Those all survive the reorganization, and they end up in the same hands they were in the day before. The old man on the golf course understood this immediately. The government had spent 10 years and enormous political capital to take his company apart. It had handed him 34 of them. If you found this worth your time, subscribing helps more than you would think. This channel takes the events you already know and follows the money underneath them, and there is a new one every week. Leave a comment and tell me which one you want next. There is a list, and it is long. Thank you for watching.